So good afternoon, everyone. So we'll get moving with our third keynote speaker. It's again my great honor and pleasure to be introducing our next keynote speaker, Professor Meredith Marra, who's from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. She's director of the world-renowned Wellington Language in the Workplace project, which has been going on for decades. So I think the work they've been doing has had a lot of foresight, I think, and influencing things in the field, and perhaps other parts of the field are only just catching up a couple of decades later. So really remarkable. In her research, she focuses on sociolinguistic and socio-pragmatic dimensions of workplace discourse. She's published on numerous topics, including on humour, relational practice, leadership, politeness, impoliteness, and identity in the workplace, among other things. She's co-author of the groundbreaking Oxford University Press monograph, Leadership, Discourse and Ethnicity, as well as co-editing some really important volumes on identities of work and also negotiating boundaries in the workplace. In today's keynote, which is co-authored with Janet Holmes, because we were discussing before a lot of the work they do, it's really akin to a science lab more than a traditional humanities type of approach. So they really work collaboratively on everything. So they acknowledge each other in their work. So in this keynote, it's mostly Meredith. She's acknowledging Janet. It will be bringing a metapragmatic lens to bear on workplace discourse. So looking forward to that. So the title here, Chinese with a lower status will speak like not very loud, metapragmatics and workplace.
Thank you so much for having me here today, and for the organisers for inviting me to come to Brisbane. Brisbane was the last trip I did before lockdown in New Zealand, and so I'm very pleased that Brisbane is the first trip I can do, that we're not in that situation anymore, we will hope. I also do want to thank the rest of the Language in the Workplace team who have worked with me on this presentation, and especially Janet Holmes. What I'm reporting is a lot of work that we've done together, and I really like that Michael saw what we see, which is that we work as a lab in all our work. I also want to, as a visitor, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And as a New Zealander, those kind of acknowledgements of what's going on in our communities is really important to me, and you'll see that coming through in the material that I present today. We've seen more and more the evidence of metapragmatics being a trend that people are looking at. And in workplace discourse, it's becoming more and more frequent too. And it's giving us some extra information about what's going on. So I wanted to focus on this idea of talk about talk, or language use about language use, that we see coming through in our data. And I'm also going to give you some background about the New Zealand context, because I will be giving examples that come from that context. And it's always I'm very keenly aware that the contextual information is really important to understand what's going on. So, as people working in pragmatics, we talk about talk all the time. We've been talking about talk for days now. But does everyone? Or is it just us that talks about talk? And if they are talking about talk, how are those discussions being managed and being negotiated? And does that talk about talk really reflect practices, or is it just talk? And do you tell people if they get it wrong? And what do you use to tell them they've got it wrong? I don't think we tell people when they've got it right. So maybe it's when we break the norms that we talk about what the ways you need to talk, or what things mean. And I obviously think this is very important for intercultural communication. I take quite a broad definition of what counts as culture. So it might be down to the team level, that we think about different understandings and norms about how you interact together. So I think there's definitely some lessons to be learned in terms of intercultural communication. To start off with, though, I wanted to give you an example from dominant cultural norms within New Zealand. So I myself identify as part of the dominant group. I label myself Pākehā, which would be the majority group in New Zealand in terms of power and status. New Zealand is often of British origin. So that's where I don't align, that's how I identify, I suppose. And I recognise that that's my place within society, and as a researcher, it's important especially when I talk about Māori cultural norms. I'm an out-group member in those. I don't want to claim something I'm not, but I realise that when I talk about Māori data, people often assume that I'm Māori myself. I'm not. So this is an example of dominant group members talking about talk. And it's an example from a government department where a senior policy analyst has been asked for advice on how someone should respond in writing to someone. And I hope you notice immediately that it's very mitigated and very hedged. I think what we should do, this is just my feeling instinctively, but the important thing in terms of talking is just say thanks for sending us a copy. We've already participated in the policy guidelines and we have no further comments to make, but we appreciate getting your copy. This is kind of almost dictating to the other person the way they should be writing, the way they should be talking about particular things, the way to respond to a particular request. But as well as that hedging at the beginning, there's clearly lots of time here and space for mitigation, for negotiation, for navigating what might be the norms about the way you should talk, the way you should respond to this particular request. And that idea of mitigation and being implicit and being indirect and not being too forceful in terms of the meta talk is matched in lots of other ways when people are giving advice between two members of a dominant group in New Zealand. Perhaps you might like to think about, have you considered, that's one of the acts we'll put on, isn't it? There are lots of options you can consider. How about you talk to? Have you thought about? All very mitigated and implicit. But never claiming ownership of this is the way you do things. I raise that because, as we see, this is going to be different if you're not part of the majority group. And to talk about this, I've got this cartoon, which I know some of you will have seen before. It's a way of me trying quite simplistically to explain the sociocultural context within New Zealand. So in terms of my own ethnic identity, I fit in with the two middle-aged women in the middle, saying shouldn't be allowed. If people come to someone else's country, they should learn the language and respect the culture. And I'm sure you recognise that kind of sentiment. The group higher up on the escalator are meant to represent migrants coming to New Zealand. The group lower down on the escalator are meant to represent the Indigenous population within New Zealand, the Māori population, and you get here being said by those two, saying, yes, maybe you Pākehā could have done the same thing when you arrived as colonisers in New Zealand. But that kind of describes sociocultural makeup. We like to talk about ourselves as bicultural and promoting multiculturalism, but there is still definitely a monolingual, monocultural mindset that permeates a lot of society. So if you're not from the dominant group, what does it look like when people talk about talk? And I've got some examples to start off with. It's going to be interesting to me is to see if you have reactions to this. So the first example is a Chinese migrant administrative assistant handing a draft to her New Zealand manager and saying, here is my draft, please check it for me today. And then later on, the manager saying, you've done a great job on this one, and then getting no response. And a second example is two colleagues coming together and one saying, did you have a good weekend? And the other saying, why do you ask this? So I'm guessing that some of you will have the reaction that there's something amiss in these interactions, that people aren't necessarily on the same page in terms of their understanding of how meaning making works or why these things are important. Perhaps you think in the first one, telling your manager to check the draft today might be something you can't really do upwards, very explicit directive, and the use of please, as we've found in our data, and Nikki Redford in particular, one of our colleagues said, please only ever exists in emails between native speakers as please see attached, and anytime there's please in the email, it's actually quite rude, not polite at all. And in the second example, maybe you react to the idea that saying nothing when you're complimented is also somehow just preferred. And then in the bottom example, when somebody asks you about the weekend, the idea that you're going, well, why is somebody asking me about my weekend? What are they trying to do with that? You kind of might say, well, it's just small talk. But I would put it to you that there are lots of alternative explanations for what's going on. And I can think of many, many occasions when all of these reactions would be totally appropriate, and they have happened with these reactions and they've not been seen as problematic. But you might look at these and say, if somebody said to you, why is this rude? You would probably have an explanation for it. If somebody said to you, why is this appropriate? You may not have an explanation. You might have to look a bit harder for one, but you could probably label what's going on in terms of meaning making or language use as to why there might be problems in there. I would argue there's nothing actually wrong with any of them because everything relies on context. And all of that is about the norms that a particular community has. So how do you do things around here? And I thought about this yesterday with this one when he talked about core common ground. I think that's probably what I'm thinking about here too. So it's also about that collective salience idea, but on a much smaller scale in the way that we look at it. So we're more likely to look at it in terms of things like communities of practice, where there is situated learning and you learn how to be a member of the group and how to do things around here, which are it's co-constructed and negotiated over time. But those really count for the norms of how we behave. And this idea of workplace norms is something that we've been looking at for a long time and something we do in particular in a course based on our data, which is called Workplace Communication for Skilled Migrants. It's a course that's actively aimed at, rather than telling skilled migrants how to behave, giving them discourse analytic tools and the dimensions that you might like to consider to work out how your interaction is going to be interpreted, most likely, and whether or not you want to follow those norms. So we get them to ask questions like, do meetings begin with social talk? How formal are your meetings? Can people interrupt each other? Do people give audible feedback during those meetings? Do people chat around the meetings? Do they chat at the lift? Do they chat at the water cooler? Is there cake for birthdays? And if there is, who provides it? That might seem like a random list of questions, and you might reflect on your own teams to see if you can answer those questions. But those are the questions that we've found to be very common things across workplaces. So we give these ideas, these prompts to the participants in the course for things that they might be able to look out for to make sense of what's going on and to make sense of what might be considered the shared practice in their organisation. The cake for birthdays might seem rather random, but I know that Doreen Van Meerop, who some of you will know, when she visited our university, the thing that she took away was the emails that came out to staff saying there's going to be morning tea today, and the end was always, there will be cake. And she knew that there will be cake means everybody's going to go to morning tea. That's where you'll see everybody. It was like a code for this is going to be a good morning tea. So it's not that random, and the idea of things that happen at morning tea being an important part of the workplace and for working together is the reason we put that particular question to the group. And so these ideas for us are bound up in a theoretical perspective for understanding these norms, which we consider ourselves to take a social realist stance. So we recognise there is an impact of various social structures, but there's still agency at play. And the social structures are like contextual constraints on the way that we interact. But these all operate at the same time. So we're constantly balancing the various constraints. And as examples of those constraints, it might be societal norms that are shared more broadly. It might be industry norms, so the way you do academia, the way you do conferences. It might be team norms, so the way you do conferences in Pragmatics, or the way you do conferences as an Australasian community, or the way you do conferences as the UQ community, depending on how you envisage the team. And then it might be how you do plenaries, or how you do seminars, or how you do whatever interactional, or how you do breaks in between different sessions. And all of those layers are working together, and we're managing those layers. And all of those layers have norms, and we're constantly moving between those norms and using indexicalities of what's salient to show that we're following or joining the group or not joining the group. That's kind of the theoretical stance we take. But very much resting on norms and the way we do things around here. And we talk about the New Zealand culture order, and that's what I was getting at when I showed you the cartoon, the hierarchical order of whose norms are privileged. The gender order, which I imagine that you've come across, the hierarchical ordering of gender, is one of the particular things we would look at the societal level as well. And then those industry norms and team norms are the way we do things around here. And in New Zealand, we would argue that all of these are cross-cut by Māori interactional norms as well, and Māori cultural norms. They impact on things we do, sometimes very explicitly, and sometimes well below the level of consciousness. So these norms, this sign says norms we never close, and I would argue yes, norms are always there. They don't ever go away, but they're often below the radar. They're not necessarily aware of what the norms are in our groups. But sometimes the norms are named, sometimes they are made explicit. And this is where we start to get towards this metapragmatics of people talking about what the norms are. Sometimes even when they're made explicit, they're quite hard to follow. This is an example from where one of the participants in our skilled migrants program was in an internship, and his mentor was trying to explain how the team operated within the organization. And he used this interesting analogy of describing his team as being the nurses. We're the nurses. And it's the idea that the whole organization is a hospital. They, as the accountants in the organization, are not the top tier. Top tier are apparently the surgeons, but the accountants are like the nurses who have to do the prep work. And we have to make sure everything's going to work in order for them to do their jobs properly. So we're very important, but we're not at the top of the hierarchy. There's a whole lot of information here about the hierarchical organization of the organization of the company, of where they fit. It is including the migrant intern as part of the group because we are the nurses. He's included in part of that. But saying nobody can really function without us, but this is where we fit. Can you imagine being an intern, going to an organization and having this description put at you? I'm not sure that I would understand how I was meant to operate in this context. But this is somebody trying to explain the norms of what's going on. Because we don't always have good ways of doing it. We haven't always thought about it. But this is somebody very explicitly being ratified as someone who can explain the norms, because this is a mentor who's been set up to help Isaac smooth his entrance into this organization as an intern and as a skilled migrant in the New Zealand context. So that's a very kind of implicit discussion of what the norms are. The explicit example I'm going to show you, some of you will know, it's one of my favorite pieces of data from our project. It's an example where Māori interactional norms are made very, very explicit in a very humorous way. So in this organization, they describe themselves as being a Māori organization. So they do things for Māori, they're there for Māori, and they follow Māori cultural norms or tikanga as their ways of operating. And there are members of the group that identify as Pākehā, like me. Many of the group are Māori, but we would argue that it's the group together that construct themselves as Māori. It doesn't matter what your individual ethnicity is. It does matter here, however. In this example, Steve, who is Pākehā, is giving a report. And he's giving a report to the senior team at the organisation. On his report, there is a map with an indication of a place called Maraetai. So that's important to know because it comes up. And Frank and Daniel, Frank his immediate senior and Daniel the senior again, have this quiet conversation off to the side. Frank says, "What's Maraetai?" And Daniel responds, "It's by your lecture." It took us a very long time to get that joke, so I'm realizing that many of you will have not got it. If you say Maraetai in a very emphasized way, it sounds like my right eye. So what's my right eye mean? It's by your left eye. And it's a very standard joke, but one that Frank did not know and one that we did not know either. But one of our Māori research assistants looked at us strangely and like, really? You don't get that? With a very standard uncanned joke. The more interesting thing is what happens after this little exchange to the side. Because Steve says one of the important things in communication is not to talk when others are talking. Everybody laughs. They laugh. He's made a norm explicit. He's likely made it explicit because we're recording at the time. So maybe it's for our benefit to say, I know what effective communication is. I'm about to state it. They're also laughing because he's telling off his seniors. But it's Frank that gets the last laugh, but not at Steve's sake. It's really a very collaborative laugh sequence. Because what he says is, Steve, this indicates a need for you to be out and doing meetings. One of the things that you learn very quickly is that a sign of respect is that other people are talking about what you're saying while you're saying it. And Steve laughs and says, I see, and it ends very positively, but it's really making explicit what the interactional norm is when you're following Māori cultural norms. That people talking at the same time as you is either an indication that it's an indication that they're engaged, because they're likely talking about what's going on. And the same here, that Frank and Daniel are really talking about what Steve is talking about. Silence is the awkward button, because silence is either we're completely enthralled or we're completely bored. But the audible feedback is really normal. It is not normal as a Pākehā interactional norm in New Zealand. So Steve is absolutely explicitly saying what a Pākehā would say about whether you talk at the same time as other people. So a very explicit description of the norms and what these things mean. But most of the time, we don't go around talking about the norms. We might signal if people are on track. We might signal if we've misunderstood something or if somebody's doing something that's not acceptable, but we often don't really talk about the norms. It's when they're broken that it exposes the time for the shared understandings and shared practices to be made explicit. And this idea of looking at these statements and trying to work out what information is in these statements is what we've been seeing as coming through as a trend within the field, this idea of learning from the statements that people are making about what the norms are for meaning making and language use. As I said before, language use about language use is one way of describing metapragmatics. It is the way that Michael described it at the symposium on Monday, and I thought it was a very useful way of describing it. So the metapragmatics, this idea of talk about what speech does in a particular context, there's still quite a lot of, not disagreement, quite a lot of diversity in the way that people are talking about metapragmatics. Silverstein talks about it as signalling that functions to aid comprehension of meaning. So it's signalling in everyday talk, that we have these direct and indirect signals that tell us what's happening moment by moment. And in a positive sense, you might think, well, this helps us understand what's going on, particularly if it means we're sharing the understanding of what's going on. One of the things that I think is interesting in the discussions is how much this talk about talk tells us about the ideologies that are really constraining what's going on. It talks about the ideologies that are the taken for granted assumptions about how you should behave. And the fact that people talk about how you need to behave is reinforcing these assumptions and making them somehow set in stone. I would always argue that ideology is negotiated, but this is one of the things that I think this metapragmatic talk is contributing to, creating these ideologies that then become quite hard to challenge. So in terms of ideologies, I would never want to say that descriptions of ideologies actually match practices. They're not doing that. We shouldn't ever expect people's descriptions of what's going on match what they're really doing. But they do tell us what people are oriented to. So they tell us when something goes wrong, and somebody says that's not the way you do that, or that's a really rude way of doing it, they're telling us how you might describe what's going wrong. So they're what we orient to. And we need to really consider this metapragmatic talk alongside other things that are happening. But it does give us this extra layer of understanding of what's going on, some of the dimensions that might be made relevant in communities about what is an acceptable way to understand something, to do something, to talk about things, all these kinds of practices. So because most of the time things look as if they're harmonious and look as if they're going right, one of the things I want to show you now is times when people actually make statements about it. And that's why the skilled migrant data we have, which is people who, the course is based on our authentic recordings within the workplace and the dimensions that we've found within there. And then, as I say, teaching discourse analysis skills. And it's 6 weeks in the classroom and 6 weeks in an internship that's supported by workplace advisors and by mentors and by time in the classroom to unpack what's happening. And it's a program that has been very successful in terms, it's been government supported until very recently, and has actually got people into work. To join the course, you have to have professional experience, You have to have IELTS of at least 6 for those people that understand IELTS. And you have to have been unemployed or underemployed for at least 2 years to get into the course. So these are people that come to New Zealand on a category of visa that says we need you in the labour force, but then get to New Zealand and don't find work and are often told it's because they can't speak English, which is not true at all. So it's a course of direct pragmatic instruction and then the experience of being in workplaces as well. So because it's a supported internship, the mentors and workplace advisors are really set up to give information about how you should behave, interact, both how you should behave in general, but how you should behave interactionally. And so we have examples of mentors telling skilled migrants how to talk. And here's my first example. This is Simon talking to Henry, who's one of the interns, giving him advice, in particular, that he should speak louder. And he frames it as being the way New Zealanders do things. So he says, in reaction to what Henry has been doing, it doesn't work that way in New Zealand. I know that you have a different culture, a different, language, and you recognize that there are different ways of doing things. So people will be more understanding. They will be more understanding. So people will be tolerant of what you're doing. But you need to say things with energy. That's a New Zealand thing very much. We like energy, we like enthusiasm, we like keen people. As a New Zealander, I have no clue if we like keen people, we like energy, or we like to speak loudly. But it's really interesting that that's what Simon sees as what Henry's doing that doesn't match New Zealand norms. He says it's about loudness. And one of the reasons I've raised this is because it's not unusual for the mentors to tell skilled migrants they need to speak louder. So this is another example. This time they're giving feedback to Helena, who's another one of the migrants, and it's both the workplace mentor and the consultant advisor who's there. And again, so the way we react to people, presumably a we that means New Zealanders, not just this organisation. We help people that come and ask us questions. We help the ones that talk the loudest. And then there's laughter because it is a bit awkward, but also the loudest. And it's interesting because it goes going on as it commands attention. It's another explanation that New Zealand gives. And there is an implication that if you don't talk loudly, we're not going to give you attention. So there's a whole lot of implications there. But again, loudness seem to be the way that you behave as a New Zealander. I really hope that's not the stereotype of all New Zealanders. I think we're often told off for muttering and mumbling and all these kind of things, which is not loudness, but maybe certain kinds of New Zealanders, I don't know. But it wasn't one I recognised, and I did try out my talk with my colleagues in New Zealand, and we all kind of looked at each other about this loudness until somebody wanted to ask a question and said, I have a big loud voice, a big voice. Oh, you're enacting this norm. But if you're constantly being told things like you need to speak louder, it is definitely something that's impacting on your own understanding. And I would argue that it's a microaggression at the very least. So microaggressions have typically been thought of in racial terms. So it's these tiny little things that happen all the time that suggest that somehow you're not okay. So brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioural and environmental indignities. And sometimes they're intentional, sometimes they're not, but they tell you you're not okay. Very often, as I said, negative racial slights, and Sue and colleagues looking at this were definitely looking at it through race, but it's not just through race that microaggressions occur, although the examples I have shown you have been based on this. And this idea of having to speak one way, and that's the only way to be like a New Zealander, without recognising that New Zealanders are not all the same. And even New Zealanders, there's Pākehā New Zealanders and Pākehā New Zealanders are not all the same. And there's lots of other kinds of New Zealanders. And increasingly, like 25% of New Zealanders were not born in New Zealand, yet we still have this claim of New Zealanders all being the same. So these are constant things that are saying you're not one of us. And I wanted to bring this example in now because it's a contrast to the one of Henry being told to speak louder and Helena being told to speak louder. In this case, Pam is telling Sophie to speak quietly. So this Pam is the advisor, so somebody giving feedback to the interns. And it's been noted that Sophie sometimes meets a friend at lunchtime and they speak Mandarin to each other. And Pam recognizes that speaking Mandarin to another Mandarin speaker is not unusual. And she says, I know you can't easily talk English to them, but the problem is it's a bit weird for people around you. It's just a bit, sometimes people, especially New Zealanders, they feel a bit uncomfortable because they don't know what's going on, you know. But I mean, if you're aware, maybe keep your voice down a bit so that it doesn't, she continues. So there's a whole lot to unpack in that. And I do recognize that Pam is not trying to be even benevolently racist at this point. Pam is trying to smooth Sophie's way in the workplace, and she is ratified as someone that could smooth Sophie's way. And Sophie wants to be told how to interact in the workplace, because the members of this course have actively tried to get into this course. They have to go through an interview process and everything. They want to be in the course. They want to get this information. They want to know how to settle. But there's a whole lot of stuff here about New Zealand ways of behaving. And it's not pleasant, even as a New Zealander, to think that, yes, it's probably quite accurate that there are many New Zealanders who assume that everybody not speaking English is talking about them. So it's not even necessarily a very nice thing as a New Zealander to say about other New Zealanders. But it's interesting that it's still an assumption that Sophie should behave like a New Zealander, that Sophie should adhere to the norms, the apparent norms about the way you should talk. And I put a B on this because it seems like it's nice and supportive. But actually, if you're constantly being stung by a bee, it gets to a point where one last sting is just one sting too many. And so this is the kind of idea of microaggressions that's coming through when metapragmatic norms are being discussed, especially if you're not from the dominant group. So it's one of the things that we can also see coming through in these discussions. And there are lots of victims of microaggressions. So I've talked about cultural difference, but it's language difference and it's race difference as well. And within my national context, we see non-English speakers getting microaggressions all the time, people from cultures other than Pākehā culture, older people, LGBTQI+ people, younger people, women, and people with disabilities. So anybody that's not really seen within our society as a majority group. And it's these tiny little aggressions all the time that have an impact. And we see them in this metapragmatic discussion. Because belonging, which is one of the things we've been focusing on for quite a long time, relies on this idea of norms. Indexing the norms, engaging with the norms, following the norms in your practices is part of showing that you fit in, part of showing that you're one of us. But very much alongside with microaggressions, you get, if you are one of us, you are right. And if you are not one of us, you are wrong and you are othered. So these discussions of metapragmatics that I've shown you are really challenges to people to say that they don't fit, because only people who follow these norms are the ones that belong. So these microaggressions are constantly reiterating the other. You're not one of us. And so they are telling us about ideologies. They are, who is sanctioned to say these things? What things do they say? What is the basis of what they say? And why are you necessarily wrong for not following them? I wanted to give you some reactions that some of the interns had to being told about these things, because I think that maybe gives us a little bit of hope. We'll see if you have the same reaction. There's a thing in chat, so if something's gone wrong with the sound, that would be good to know. Okay, so the first one I have is from Salvador, who is an intern from the Philippines and talking to his mentor, Suzanne. And they're talking about the fact that one of the colleagues has encouraged Salvador to go to morning tea. Morning tea is clearly very important to New Zealand. I've mentioned it, I think, 4 times now. But going to tea is because when you go to tea, you meet people. And it's part of the work ethic is that you take breaks, have lunch, you keep sustaining yourself for some work, but it's also that you get to talk to other people. And Salvador's response is that, yes, that Suzanne is keeping on telling him to take a break, but I tend to forget what the time is because I'm so engaged with what I'm doing. I really like my work, so I forget that I need to go. This doesn't just happen once, this is picked up again later on in the session, the interview that's happening with the workplace advisor as feedback to Salvador. And that workplace advisor reiterates this point. It's good to go to level 5, to morning tea with Alan, and it's good that you talk to other people. So there's the we need to talk to each other thing going on. And Salvador responds as if being told this is a positive thing. And as I said, in that context, he has asked for advice. There are people sanctioned to give him advice, ratified to give him advice. He's getting advice, he's taking it on board. And he said, yeah, it's a good opportunity for me. Meeting other people in different areas, yes, that's true. So he seems to accept and take ownership of what should happen according to this discussion of what you're meant to do, who you're meant to talk to, and when. Is resistance futile? Do you have to accept being told that this is the way you're meant to behave interactionally? And is there space for more than one norm? If you remember our model, we argue that there's a whole lot of layers of norms that are happening all together. And yet those norms should be, well, they are, from our perspective, negotiated. They become more stable as people spend more and more time together, but they're intentionally, in our understanding, negotiable and navigated and balanced. So if that's the case, what happens when you're not the dominant group member and you do want to challenge the apparent norm that is being discussed? So you will remember Simon telling Henry that he had to speak more loudly because we like energy, we like enthusiasm, and we like keen people. Henry was very clever in his response to this. Clever in particular by the way in which he enacted his response to this. So first of all, he talked about why he might not behave that way, why he might not speak loudly, so with lots of metapragmatic awareness of what he's doing. So Henry had had his work experience in China before he came to New Zealand. He points out that maybe it's a cultural difference. And then we get the title of my talk today. He describes issues based on hierarchy and status. That Simon has status that's higher than him. Simon is his mentor. So usually the Chinese with a lower status will speak not very loud. So he's pointing out to Simon, that might be your norm. It's not my norm. The clever thing that he did was he said this very loudly. So he's showing, I understand what you're telling me about the norms. I'm enacting what you're telling me, but I'm also not agreeing with you. So that discussion allowed him to say there are other things going on. Henry was always my favorite when I taught in this class. I go in and I teach small talk for an hour. And Henry was my favorite because he engaged with me right from the beginning in various ways. So I always tracked him, and I was so proud to know that he had responded in this way in his workplace. I don't think it necessarily changed Simon's view, but at least he was challenging what was happening, which was empowering for him. Leo and Isaac was the example of you need to put yourself out there, so you need to talk to people and ask people to help you. Go, hey, I don't know what this is, please help me, and then you get help from people, and you're learning to get help from people. And Isaac's response was something that I think I experienced as a younger New Zealander, maybe even still now. Sometimes I'm afraid that maybe I disturb other people's working, so I just wait for the right time to go. I think many of us in the room will recognise not wanting to disturb people. So he is enacting actually what I would consider pretty standard New Zealand norm in this, but challenging what he's been told by Leo as to how to interact, to go in and interrupt people, ask for help. Leo's perspective, I'm sure, is intended to say you need to just make space, because you need to be one of us and this is how you're going to do it. So I think it's benevolently suggested. The interesting thing is how Leo responds. Is he tells him how people are interpreting and not interrupting. They're working away saying, Isaac's happy, he hasn't seen me, he must be okay. So you've got to go and do it. So there is some resistance there, and there's a negotiation of why you would do this. And then that it forces you to keep talking, because talking is what you apparently need to do. So keep talking. But I do point out that I don't want to criticize these mentors in any way, because this is really what they were asked to do. They were tasked with socializing. They were expected to give feedback. Their part of their willingness to volunteer was so that they could be helpful. They were trying to help the skilled migrants get into work in New Zealand. They did recognise the need for skilled migrants in New Zealand. So I don't want to be criticising at all. It was absolutely what everybody wanted in the context. I do question how widely held the norms are that they're talking about. I do question if these are actually the things that are important in terms of pragmatics in New Zealand. I do also wonder how much the mentors had thought about these in advance, or whether they were making them up on the spot, because they said something's going wrong here. What is the explanation I can use for what's going wrong here? Which, as I said at the beginning, that allows us to see what people are orienting to, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how people behave. But it does tell us that these are the kinds of things we use as explanations for what's rude, or what's polite, or what's acceptable, or what's unacceptable. They're also telling us about expectations for newcomers to any group. So the expectation that newcomers are meant to do it our way, whoever the our is and that whoever the we is. It's also suggesting that while we might talk about tolerance of difference as being a really important part of our cultural makeup, actually there doesn't seem to be very much tolerance of difference. So we are getting information about that. It tells us a lot about the circulation discourses within society about what is acceptable, what's not, and also about the hierarchical orders within society about whose norms are the ones that should be followed. So if we think about the New Zealand culture order as having Pāhia norms as the dominant ones and other norms underneath, I would argue Māori cultural norms probably come next, because we have commitments to a treaty that says we are bicultural. I don't know how much we enact that in practice, but then below that we have other cultural groups, and it's definitely a hierarchical order about whose norms are privileged and prioritised and seen as acceptable. And in this metapragmatic discussion, we get to see those coming through. But I don't want to leave you with a sign of there being no hope. Instead, I'm going to go back and revisit this description I gave of New Zealand society and put myself in the non-dominant position in my final section. So in this case, I want to go back to Māori norms and where they might fit within New Zealand, and think about how metapragmatic discussion might change practices. And in particular, I want to talk about whakatauki. So whakatauki are proverbs that are normally used in both formal speech and in casual speech. They're ways of understanding the worldview, and they're ways of setting up the environment in a certain way. So in terms of meetings in New Zealand, Pāhia meetings will often start with just, okay, that's enough to start a meeting in New Zealand. And the end might just end with thank you, or even okay at the end as well. That's enough to signal a meeting has started and finished. In meetings that are more oriented to Māori, there's likely to be much more of a ritual of encounter, sometimes with a karakia or prayer, some kind of greeting. And whakatauki can sit in that position as well. But as I say, they can fit anywhere. The reason we've focused on whakatauki is because our most recent data collection, which was the very end of last year, we were in a workplace following a Māori leader who we've pseudonymed Greg, and we consider Greg one of our super participants because we have now recorded him 3 times over 25 years. When Michael introduced me as having done this stuff for decades, it made me feel very old. Michael, you and I are the same age. But we have worked with Greg on 3 occasions over the 25 years. Each time we've seen his leadership being enacted in ways that are negotiated with his team. And in the last two cases we've recorded him, he's been the CEO, and he uses Whakatauki as part of his interactions with the senior leadership team. And really it's been a chance for us to see how the team shapes him and how he shapes the team and their ongoing practices. And one of the interesting things for us is that he uses the same Whakatauki with different teams. We've actually seen how he's engaged with them. I've got the Whakatauki there at the bottom. The English translation is typically a small thing given with love. Or even though it's a small thing, it's given with love, and there are various variations on it. But this is important you understand that, because I'm going to show you a discussion of a place, this current workplace, where the people in it are trying really hard to understand and learn other norms. And they do it through really explicit discussion, not just about the norms, but also the language components of those norms. So Greg starts each meeting with the senior leadership team with a Whakatauki. And you'll notice he says, okay, I'll Whakatauki. And then states the Whakatauki of the day. What you see at that point is the rest of the team repeating back the Whakatauki to him. It's a way of enacting language learning. Because for most of them, they are language learning at this point. So they're learning culture, they're learning meaning, and they're learning language at the same time. And this particular workplace was quite distinctive with their real focus on language. And at this point, Greg goes on to explain what's going on in the language that's used in the Whakatauki. So he describes particular words, what they mean, how they relate to other language items they've been looking at, and it's in quite technical terms. I mean, not for us necessarily as linguists, but he's explaining the present tense, continuous action. So he really is giving them a language lesson on this Whakatauki and being both bicultural and bilingual in this organisation, but having very explicit discussions about how you use language. And it goes through various parts of the Whakatauki. And it's quite a long discussion. It's allowing quite a lot of space to talk about this particular way of thinking, way of interacting, way of behaving. And it goes on, so we're still going in this discussion of the Whakatauki. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I wanted to point out some stuff that's going on in here. Greg identifies as Māori, Aroha identifies as Māori, and she uses the time with these whom's to endorse what he's saying. So endorsing the discussion of what this means and how you should use this language. And then Greg takes the opportunity to actually look at pronunciation and talks to people about the pronunciation. That people can't say reo properly, and it's a very, very common word. It's a word we use in New Zealand English as well. It means Māori language, but we use it in New Zealand English as well as in Māori. And teaching how you make that particular sound and what happens. And the reason I pointed that out is because of the engagement from the rest of the group. So he describes how it should be said. And so he then gets it repeated. Somebody says it to try it out with them. So not being afraid to try out new things. And then he endorses it. It may not surprise you that when I presented this to my colleagues, half the room said reo out loud after reading the way he described it. So it was an engagement of different ways of doing things based on talking about talk. So a really positive example of a group wanting to learn new ways of doing things. That's 2:20, so I'm going to finish, and I can't believe that I put on a slide for a New Zealand accent to say, why does meta matter? Because for many of you, that's just all the same vowel sound, I'm sure. But I really do think that this focus on metapragmatics and meta talk and meta communication in general is giving us extra information that we may not necessarily looked at before. It's always been there, but I'm not sure that people have really paid enough attention to it. I know within sociolinguistics, there have been various attempts to get more focus on meta communication in general. The end of the 90s, there was a little spate of articles and plenaries trying to get people to think about it. And I know that more recently, colleagues, particularly in gender and sexuality, have been talking about meta discourse again. And I think that there's been a lot of discussion, especially on Monday at the Humour Symposium, about metapragmatics. And it allows us maybe not to see what the pragmatics actually is, but allows us to see what people think about when they're making judgments, when they're making evaluations. And I think in particular, it's really a powerful way for us to understand people that are being excluded. So what does this mean about exclusion? What does it mean, hopefully, then about inclusion in some cases? But really, it tells us what's going on and allows people within talk to challenge. Because if somebody uses meta talk with you, it gives you a chance to negotiate backwards if you are empowered enough. And I think I'm going to end with something that I think everybody in the room probably believes, but something that I think we need to remind ourselves all the time, that we need conferences like this because meaning making is complex. It's not straightforward. There's lots of subtleties to it. We have to be quite sophisticated in our understandings of things. We need to recognize how nuanced things are and also how dynamic things are. So long may pragmatics exist, I think is what I'm saying there. And I just wanted to thank all the participants that work with us, because we don't have participants working with us, we don't have data. So that's where I wanted to finish. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Meredith. That was a wonderful talk, really thought-provoking. So, questions from the audience? There is someone. Okay, I'll take a quick look.
Oh, is it from Janet? Oh, yes, Janet. Right, Janet's actually there for support. She said.
Oh, okay.
Janet's actually there. Here, can I?
Yeah, you go.
I know you run a course for the do you run a course for
Yeah. Sorry, can you just give us a second, because we need the mic for the people who are online so they can hear what you're saying. Well, they'll be able to pick it up.
I'm going to repeat it anyway. So
Okay,
Kerry pointed out that I talked about the interns, running a course for the interns. What about the workplace people and New Zealanders? A course is run for New Zealanders. Some industries want us to tell them about it because they know they have labour shortages. Many New Zealanders don't care. It is actually a government policy that anything needs to be two-way. So every time we've developed resources, we develop resources for a newcomer and so the employee and the employer. And they're at the moment on the New Zealand Now website. So they're like, if you're coming to New Zealand, here are some ways that things happen, but they are there accessible for both sides because it's a negotiation. But getting dominant group New Zealanders to recognise that their norms are not the only way of doing things is not necessarily an easy thing to do. It's when you're in the out group or you're a minority group member, that's when these norms become very obvious. When you're a majority group member, it's just the way we do things around here. Yeah. So we're trying, but yeah.
Questions from the audience? Can you do my best to have it here?
It's yeah, it's okay. I'm not sure if it's okay. It's not really a question. I did just something really resonated with me. I'm German, been living in Australia for 3 years, and I realized when you mentioned whether the people giving these courses or giving this feedback were just making it up as they go, and I think that's very true, because as you said, it's very implicit and you don't actually are really aware of your cultural norms. And I think the amount of things that I've made up about Germany when I'm trying to explain my culture to new friends or colleagues or things, and I think and afterwards I always find myself saying, I generalized way too much there. I think I'm not sure if that's actually true. What I just said, I don't know, because I've never actually thought about this before someone asked me about something in Germany. So I think it's a lot of these things like you have to be loud or something, which is probably not true. They just made it up because in the moment they needed some sort of explanation. They were confronted. I feel like I've been guilty of this. So maybe, if you're providing resources for the people giving these courses, maybe I'll look into this, but it's really difficult because no one's aware of their own culture until they have to teach the culture to someone.
And even then, we do kind of think about the culture of being more prolific, but it never is. It's not all the same. But I know that one of the things that we talk about all the time as New Zealanders is tall poppy syndrome. I know Australians talk about it all the time. So we still orient to it. I'm not sure we actually follow it a lot of the time. But if somebody does something that's problematic, you'll go, oh, that's because of the tall poppy syndrome. So the tall poppy syndrome is, it's based on the metaphor of the poppy that grows the tallest, the wind comes along and knocks the head off. So you don't want to stand out. You don't want to suggest you're better than other people. And so we still orient to it. We know that it's relevant and people use it as a way of explaining things, but sometimes you see it in practice, sometimes you don't. So it's the same thing, but yes, yeah, we do. I don't think those mentors would think they made it up. I think they would be quite convinced that they were being accurate about how New Zealand was taught, because nobody's challenging them. Or nobody they think has the power to challenge them. It's challenging. But as I said to Kerry, it's really important we point this out to both sides and that it's seen as something you do together. Kerry, on the microphone's there.
Sorry, well, that just makes me think then, do you go back to the mentors afterwards and look at any of this data with them and have this conversation with them?
So some of them want to do that. So some of them are very engaged in that process and will take interns time and time again. And the workplace advisors and consultants are very much engaged with us. They're the liaison between, so there is a way of getting feedback back. But at the same time, these are people volunteering to take interns into their workplace. So we're not going to tell them off. And us telling them off is doing exactly what we say we're doing. So it's an important relationship and it's a fragile relationship. So it depends on how engaged they are. But really, some of them take interns over and over again. And then Nikki Bradford runs the course. And has some of people know Nikki from the applied linguistics community. And she has built this amazing network of people that have been through the course that have been supporting each other and building a community. And sometimes people from the beginning years of the course are now taking interns themselves. So they're in that position. At the moment, we don't have government funding. Just at the moment. So we're trying it. But it's been going since 2004, so we've had a good run. Yeah.
I do have a question.
Okay. I'm sure you do.
It's about the microaggressions thing. So can I check my understanding? When the mentors are giving advice and provoking norms, and it's sort of pretty hegemonic, right? You see that as potentially a microaggression?
Potentially.
Yeah.
If they're repeated over and over again, because they're seeing them as positive, but they're not necessarily landing as positive. Okay. There's, I'm trying to think about what the, so I'm a native speaker of New Zealand English. When I'm overseas, I am sometimes told I speak English very well. I don't speak much else very well, so I hope I speak English well. But I'm constantly telling me I don't speak the right kind of English. And I'm pretty empowered, so it doesn't have that much effect on it. But if I was somebody else being constantly told that you speak English well, even though that's your native language, could have quite a big effect on you if it was done over and over again, like bee stick. One little bee sting doesn't hurt you, over and over again it does.
I'm just wondering, out of curiosity, whether things are changing with the new generation. Because many societal aspects in life are somehow smoothly and slowly changing. I was wondering if these are signs of UK.
So every census tells us how many more New Zealanders are not born in New Zealand. But with every census, we say things have got to change. When you get a quarter of the population not born in, things have to change in exhaustion. I'm not sure that they've changed yet. I think it's more that what we're finding is there's different groupings of people that are supporting each other. That's what's changing. There's definitely changes in terms of Māori population and where Māori cultural norms fit in New Zealand. I think the next change will be where the Pacific community belongs in New Zealand, but these are slow changes.
It is, yes. So we could ask many more questions, but perhaps we can thank Meredith for it. Thank you.